These days, one could hardly call Great Britain this sceptred isle, this precious stone set in the silver sea. It's more like this garbage-littered land set in its ways. But somehow the old cliche is correct. Britons do muddle through, and muddle is what they have right now. Some of the truck drivers have gone back to work, but at one time, 80,000 of them were on strike. 1 million public service workers had a 24-hour work stoppage last month, and half of the 2,300 state-owned hospitals are accepting only emergency cases. After more than 3 years of wage restraint under the so-called social contract, these workers have a simple demand. They want more. If a conservative government was to replace Labour, the new Prime Minister would be Margaret Thatcher. She has been portrayed as standing up to the unions, yet at the same time, to win an election, she needs at least some votes from union members. When I spoke to her at a London factory, she told me of her concerns and her strategy. What about the ordinary person, the ordinary low-income employee?
Well, we've been very, very concerned indeed about the number of strikes we've had this year because they've been more widespread. But you know, the strikes haven't really been confined to low-income employees. The lorry drivers' strike, certainly the basic wage that's quoted, is not very high. Indeed, it's low. But the average earnings have not been low average earnings. And it's really been a number of strikes about industrial muscle. And I think if you try to look at our trade union law, if you just take a look at it, because law on trade unions didn't just happen, it is where it is because of years of making it that way. You'll find that there are more powers to unions here than there are anywhere else in the world. And that really hasn't made a position of free collective bargaining, because you can really only be free if the two sides are fairly evenly balanced. And when one side has tremendous power to hold the rest of the people to ransom, you wouldn't call that a position of even balance. And that's why I say the law has to be changed. And insofar as they use power, they must use it responsibly. So we call it responsible collective bargaining. There are other problems. There's scope for increased pay by reducing restrictive practices and overmanning. And I'm afraid, again, we are one of the most overmanned countries in the world. And that's why if you get low output, you'll get per person, you tend to get low wages. And we'd like to change that.
You also get low morale because of that.
You get low morale. The other thing is that even though you get comparatively low pay, government really takes quite a large slice of it. And then they feel even more depressed and they don't get the incentive. So government has a part to play in that too.
You mentioned the fact that the unions here are more powerful than they are in other countries. That, of course, is very noticeable to us coming from Canada, because in Canada we have a different system of contracts. Their contracts are for a fixed period, and after that they're negotiable, but they are for a fixed period. Strikes are illegal.
Enforceable.
And they're
Yes.
enforceable.
But they're not here, you see. The irony is that a union could force an employer to honor his contract, but the employer couldn't force the union to honor his contract. And that's so with a pay contract. It's even so with a procedural agreement. For example, most companies would like procedural agreements, or they have them, so that you have a certain procedure to go through if there is a dispute. But even those aren't enforceable, and that's one thing also that we have to look at.
You're talking really about a situation in which power is very entrenched in a group, and you acknowledge the fact that they are the powerful ones. How do you curtail that power? How do you curtail that power without really disturbing the social fabric of your country?
There are some people who won't want it curtailed, and they are the people who've been exercising it. But you see, in our trade unions now, there are nearly 12 million people. Now, there aren't 12 million people who are anxious to exercise and wield power over their fellow citizens. Of course there aren't, because so many of them are the victims of power used by their fellow trade unionists. We have opinion surveys. I expect you have too. We don't necessarily agree with everything they say. But the surveys that have been coming out recently about trade union power have one thing in common. Whether people are members of trade unions or not, they all agree that the unions have too much power. And you'll find 75 to 80% of the people saying that. Now, under those circumstances, that is an occasion when Parliament can act because you've got public opinion behind you. It means that where you've had real problems, and you've seen some of ours like picketing, closed shop, strike of public service employees whose work is vital to the nation as a whole. That's the area where we'll have to start. Not to do everything all at once, but to start remedying the law where it clearly needs to be remedied and where public opinion is behind us. Not only public opinion, but a tremendous lot of union opinion too.
If you become Prime Minister in the next election, how would you deal with strikes in the public service sector? Would you make such strikes illegal?
I do think you've got to negotiate with some of them whose services are so vital that they can bring the nation to a dead stop, a no-strike clause, and we tackle it that way.
You've said that you would confront the problem head-on with the unions. Now, the last Prime Minister who tried to do that...
Can I just correct you? I've said if anyone in this country is trying to deprive our people of essential liberties or services essential to life, of course I will confront them, and I will have the vast majority of the people with me.